In the current media climate in this country, and with Donald Trump being Donald Trump, there are so many vital issues and important stories that get little to no attention. The civilians killed in U.S. wars, the plight of the truly poor in this country, the struggles of working people, the climate, the campaign, the moves to attack women's health care, the efforts to kick millions of people off of any kind of health care. Racism is sometimes discussed in the media in this country, but these days it's often through the lens of some Trump associate or in the context of covering the so-called alt-right phenomenon. Politicians in this country, Democrats and Republicans, always seem to jockey for position, particularly at election time, for who's the strongest law and order candidate. You know, the Hillary Clinton super predator comment that she made in the 1990s resurfaced during the presidential race last year. Less discussed, though, were the policies that her husband enacted as president that she helped advocate as first lady. But when it came to, law and order, at least on a rhetorical level, Trump took the spiel to new heights.
I am the law and order candidate.
While both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders tried and at times fumbled to address the growing Black Lives Matter movement, which of course is a decentralized movement, it arose in protest of the police killings of Black people in this country. Trump didn't even pretend that it was a serious issue, that it was a real issue. In fact, Trump often mocked it. He did not take the issue seriously. Beyond the rhetoric, Trump put a proven racist, Jeff Sessions, in charge of the Justice Department as Attorney General.
Unfortunately, in recent years, law enforcement as a whole has too often been unfairly maligned and blamed for the crimes and unacceptable deeds of a few in their ranks. Amid this intense public scrutiny and criticism, morale has gone down, while the murder of police officers killed in the line of duty has gone up.
Stocks in private prisons skyrocketed in the aftermath of Trump's election. We recently learned that David Clark, the Milwaukee County Sheriff, was going to be getting a top post at the Department of Homeland Security.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to make something very clear. Blue lives matter in America.
Sheriff Clark was a big hit at the Republican convention where he showed up looking like a military general. At least he wanted to appear as one with all of his little medallions on his police uniform. But back in Milwaukee County, and I'm from Milwaukee, Clark faces very serious questions about a string of suspicious deaths that have taken place in holding cells, jails that are under his control. But he's apparently on his way to Washington. Now, when Trump and his administration talk about crime and imprisonment in the Black community, they do it with no historical context. They feed what I would call a racist narrative in addressing some of these staggering statistics. More than 60% of people in prison today are people of color. Black men are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Hispanic men are more than twice as likely. For Black men in their 30s, 1 in every 10 is in prison or jail on any given day. The rate of imprisonment for African-American women is more than twice that of white women. Right now, the United States has more than 2 million people in prison. That's a 500% increase over the past 40 years. That's the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Joining me now is the organizer and educator, Mariame Kaba. She is the founder of Project NIA and a co-organizer of Survived and Punished. She's also one of the sharpest people I know on Twitter, where her handle is Prison Culture. Mariame, welcome to Intercepted.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you refer to yourself as an abolitionist. What do you mean by that?
Abolition for me is a long-term project and also a practice around kind of creating the conditions that would allow for the dismantling of prisons, policing, and surveillance, and the creation of new institutions that actually work to keep us safe and are not fundamentally oppressive. what you need to make those conditions happen. You have to be for addressing environmental issues. You have to be for making sure people have a living wage economically. I know for me, it's important to be anti-capitalist. All those things feed into creating the conditions that would lead to the end of the things I want to see and the bringing into being of the things I want to have.
For people who don't have a loved one that's been to prison, haven't been to prison themselves, just sort of view prison as a place where people who commit crimes go.
Right.
Set a kind of context for people of the institution of imprisonment in the United States and what that looks like.
Prison itself is a reform. I think that's something that most people don't think about, right? Prisons haven't always existed. They came into being, especially in the United States, because people were trying to react against capital punishment and corporal punishment, which were seen at the time by particularly Quakers as incredibly inhumane. So initially, the reform itself was not meant to be a brutalizing thing. But isolation itself is actually brutal. Over the years, prisons have been spaces where we've sent the people we don't like, or the people we want to manage and control socially. Early before the Civil War, most people who were locked up were not actually Black people, because almost every Black person in the country was enslaved. Immediately after, emancipation, all of a sudden, the literally complexion of prisons change. And Black people become kind of hyper targets of that system. And we create new laws, the Black codes and other things like that. Convict lease system comes into being as a way to continue to exploit the labor of the people who were now newly free. The reason to talk about that history is also to demystify for people how and why people ended up behind bars initially. That it wasn't really about real crime, but it was about a perception of Blacks as inherently criminal in order to continue to control Blacks who people thought after enslavement actually didn't have a right to be free, that Black people couldn't manage freedom. And that was the story that got told. And so the prison became a site for continuing to control Blackness. And we have arrived in the late 1960s when there was a rise in murder and in robberies, particularly. So kind of violent crimes are rising at the same time as the Black Power movement is also expanding. And these two things are being brought together.
Only our brother Martin Luther King exhausted a means of nonviolence with his life being taken by some racist. What is being done to us is what we hate. And what happened to Martin Luther King is what we hate. You darn right. We respect nonviolence. But to sit and watch ourselves be slaughtered like our brother, we must defend ourselves, as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary.
The story that gets told is that, it's mainly Nixon who comes in and puts in the kind of war on drugs, the beginning of the war on drugs. And he was like, the Republicans are to blame for how the carceral state got built more massively.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Between 1825 until the late 1960s, the prison population is stable. It's pretty low. In the late 1960s, you've got all these scholars and activists talking about the end of prison. People are talking about the prison as being over. So you have to think about how we went from the end of prison to all of a sudden the largest jailer in the whole entire international sphere in the world becomes the United States. And that's because of a set of policies that come into play. And those policies are bipartisan policies, but really take off with Johnson, where Johnson wants to fight the war on poverty, and he gives in on creating a war on crime arm of the war on poverty. And what do the Republicans do, which they always do so well? They want to defund the poverty angle, and they want to keep the war on crime.
What was the motivation in your assessment of these politicians, both Democrats and Republicans?
It was, quote unquote, the riots. It was the images of those young Black people in Watts and in 1964 in Harlem and in all these places where there were, quote, urban disorder and urban unrest. And the face of that were Black young people.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out.
This is why you can't talk about incarceration, criminalization in this country without understanding the history of Blackness and Black people in this country, the ways in which politicians have used us basically as the fuel to make things happen that then bleed out to the rest of the population. So we're always the canaries in the coal mine. We go into Bill Clinton and what he does with the 1994 crime bill.
When I signed this crime bill, we together are taking a big step toward bringing the laws of our land back into line with the values of our people and beginning to restore the line between right and wrong.
Which actually doesn't have that much of an impact in terms of spiking the numbers even higher. What he does is give people more of an ideological basis to continue to do what they've been doing. He was one of the most destructive presidents for Black people, and we're still trying to recover from his reign, both in terms of what he put into place around immigration and immigrant detention. A lot of people don't think about that as Black, but the people who are most incarcerated within immigrant detention are disproportionately Black immigrants.
Well, and of course, you had this massive atrocity that happened at Guantanamo with Haitians that were fleeing violence that the United States sponsored in the form of overthrowing Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And then you had, and I think a lot of people, particularly young people, don't know this history. Before Guantanamo was the place where Bush stuck people extrajudicially in the so-called War on Terror, Clinton piled up the bodies inside of Guantanamo of the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti.
Right. It came back to haunt Hillary Clinton in Miami with the Haitians that were there not voting for her, right? So people have long memories. But welfare reform, or what we call welfare deform, had such a disproportionate impact, particularly on single Black mothers. The ways in which the carceral state was kind of reinforced and made much more brutal through the 3 strikes laws, through the mandatory minimum sentences, which were upped, through his horrific behavior around rushing back to Arkansas during his election to go and put somebody who was mentally disabled to death, right? He really set in place the apparatus that we are still trying to dismantle today.
Under Obama, you had several incendiary killings that happened. You had George Zimmerman murdering Trayvon Martin. You had the shooting of Mike Brown, and we can go down a whole list of people. I remember as a kid growing up in Milwaukee, the police shooting an unarmed Black man named Ernest Lacy.
1981, Ernest Lacy suffocated in the back of a police van after officers arrested him for a rape he didn't commit.
These kinds of killings have always happened in this country.
Yeah.
What was it about this string of incidents that seemed to rejuvenate a rebellious atmosphere in this country that was in large part led by young African Americans and other people of color across this country, and they weren't being organized by Al Sharpton or some national network. It was a spontaneous response. Given that this has happened from the beginning of this republic to Black people from white people in authority or people with a badge, what was it about that particular moment that seemed to spark this uprising?
Almost every urban uprising that has occurred in the country's history has police violence at its root. So if you look at the 1935 Harlem riots, quote unquote, or a Harlem uprising, at the core of it is a rumor that a young Puerto Rican boy is killed, but he wasn't actually killed. And that sparks the conflagration. In 1943, that rebellion in Harlem, also at the root was Marjorie Polite and this young man and the police basically being accused of having shot him. That's a conflagration. 1964 is also a young Black man who's shot by the cops in New York City.
In the name of God, please go home and protect the dignity of our Harlem community.
I view these developments with the utmost seriousness and have given approval to all necessary steps to ensure and maintain the rule of law and order in this as well as all other parts of the city, to ensure, for example, against disorder
If you look at just the history of all the different uprisings, you can go back to the early 1900s, and all of those are cases that are sparked by police brutality. And the reason that's the case, and it's always been the case in this country, is because it is the most clear example of being treated unjustly in the country. It's the clearest way that almost every Black person can see that they are second class. In other things, it's diffuse, right? We know there are poor people. But if you yourself are not poor, in this country, you can pretend they don't exist. And that includes Black people. You can live in a way that ignores Black poor people, except that many, many Black people are tied to poor people anyway, even if they left their communities. A lot of their families still is struggling. So we see it in a different kind of way. But just not having the right to exist, to walk down the street without being harmed, that consistent knowledge of that is something
by the people who taxpayers are financing to supposedly keep order and safety.
The gatekeepers of the state are turning their guns on us. And so it is it's a sight that makes sense, where people feel a direct visceral sense that this is friggin' unfair. What are they doing to us? And that's been along the way. I think that's why it's important to put the movement for Black lives that's currently been, that continues to happen right now, in its proper context. It's only part of a long freedom struggle that has gone on in this country for as long as Black people have been here.
Because I know you're originally from New York, but you've spent the past years organizing and working in Chicago, where you also studied. And I'm curious about what your analysis is of the very high murder rate in Chicago, the proliferation of weapons on the streets, and what the kind of root cause of it is. Mm-hmm. My family is from Chicago. My dad is from Hyde Park. My brother and sister live in Chicago. And we've seen a pretty radical change in the violence levels in Chicago, or at least the reporting on it. And Donald Trump harped on this constantly in the campaign.
And then you look at Chicago. What's going on in Chicago?
Chicago became the kind of epic dog whistle for politicians who wanted to say the problem is when Black people have guns. Mm-hmm. And Chicago is basically, Spike Lee said Chirac, but, you had Lupe Fiasco, the hip hop artist, saying, well, we need General Stanley McChrystal to come in here and take control of Chicago. What is at the heart of the violence that we're seeing right now in Chicago, in your view?
In Chicago, you have to look at the whole history of what has happened. First and foremost, the last 3 years have been where we've seen homicide rates go up. But that preceded almost 15 years of it consistently going down. I think that you have to look at the disinvestment that has been going on in the last 10 years. Things take time to catch up. I mean, this is a city run by Democrats it's a city that is the test case for neoliberal economics of all different sorts. The privatization of schools, the privatization of mental health clinics, the ways in which economic violence is being done to particular communities on the west and on the south sides of Chicago. Those are the places that are the most dangerous. There's an inequality to violence in Chicago. You can be on the north side in downtown living your life. It's like you're living in another country. So I think that there are many, many reasons for why this is. And I think we're going to be in a moment where we're going to see whether or not we're going to revert back to the lock them up kind of way of the 1980s and 90s, whether we've learned anything.
When it became clear that Donald Trump was going to be president, to what did you attribute his victory?
I think there's so many things. He ran against a terrible candidate. I still maintain. I don't think that Hillary Clinton was good in terms of a contrast to him. So I think that was real. I think the Electoral College and the way that relic from slavery that exists really to disempower majorities to actually put in who they want in office, I think you cannot discount just the completely xenophobic and racist and sexist forces and internalized oppressions that exist within this country. I said during the entire election, I said this is an election for white people arguing with other white people about how to deal with the rest of us. I kept saying it before the election. I said, like, it just felt that way. Like the arguments that were being had, the Chicago as a trope, right? Like not even a dog whistle, like a high C, high key kind of yelling and primordial scream. I think that they just, a lot of white, poor people. And I just want to say this because I think this is important too. There's too much emphasis being put on the white working class. And I don't mean that in the sense that we shouldn't be paying attention to them, but they're being put as the scapegoat for why Trump came into office. His base is middle class people and rich white people. Like rich white middle class people are the real base for the Republican Party. They're the ones who put him in there. White working class people vote at a low rate compared to middle class and rich people. Just sheer number wise, they're not enough to have put him over the edge, right? But I find it interesting how white folks are so quick to throw poor white people under the bus, to blame them for why Trump came into being. No. 53% of white women voted for him. They weren't all white working class women. Right. So I'm like, don't do that. I think that I think white working class people vote at a low rate, just like poor Black people vote at a low rate. That's been the case for time immemorial. If you look at like the statistics of voting. So, yes, while some poor white people have racial resentments and, are animated by racism, this country is racist. And any appeals to othering other people at the benefit of white people are going to be seized. I think it is important to say that the majority of people didn't even vote for him. He won because of the Electoral College. Yes, and that's the system. I'm not trying to overturn the current election. I just think that we should really look at what has happened and tell the truth.
What's the significance of Jeff Sessions being the Attorney General?
I think he's a racist ideologue, clearly. I would not have wanted him to be the dog catcher in chief. He should not be in office. He should not. It was good that he wasn't a judge. All those things are true. He is a racist ideologue who is overseeing a racist, classist, sexist, transphobic system. The criminal punishment system are those things, whether Jeff Sessions is the attorney general or not.
Right. I mean, there's a level. I mean, I agree with you. And I think there's a level on which it's kind of refreshing that the person who is the figurehead actually represents the legacy of the institution. He represents
the actual institution. So now you're going to have to look at that system to understand that it isn't one man. But it's the whole damn thing that has to go, right? People keep saying, the system is guilty, the whole system has to go, and people are chanting. This is absolutely the case in this case.
Yeah, but look at what's happening in the aftermath of the firing of James Comey, the FBI director. There's this lionization of the FBI and the CIA, for that matter, by the Democrats. But on the Comey issue, it really is like, oh my God, Jim Comey was the last honest man in this country, and the FBI was keeping us safe and has all this integrity. What is your response to the dominant kind of liberal narrative now, white liberal narrative, that the FBI is on our side and they're the good guys and they're the ones keeping us safe?
But white liberals love the cops. I don't know what to tell you. Like, they always have loved the cops. I don't know that this is new. Like the cops are in all of our heads and hearts, but they're very much in liberals. Think about how the conversation is framed around cops and policing. Think about Obama. His whole entire conversation of policing has been a few bad apples. But most of the cops are great. No real drilling down on policing as a system itself is corrupt. No. People are, my Uncle Johnny is a cop and he's great. And I'm like, I don't care about your Uncle Johnny being a nice man. Policing itself is corrupt. So putting somebody within a corrupt system corrupts them. Whether Johnny is nice or good, he cannot fight against that system of that, like the blue wall of silence, the ways in which you are forced into being silent when horrible things are happening. I know cops. I've had to interact with them almost my entire adult life in various ways, right? In terms of, either advocating for young people who are being harassed or being in a space where I've actually had to interact with them in rooms where there's been policy debates and things like that. And they'll be the first to tell you that it is really impossible to get rid of bad cops. And so that means it's a systemic issue, not that it's a personal issue. So I feel like the lionization, and I don't even know if it's that, I just think like putting the FBI on a pedestal is just an extension of the love of police. in this country. And you see it with the way how unpopular in so many quarters Black Lives Matter is, and how uncomfortable white liberals are in dealing with the actual central tenet of Black Lives Matter, saying it is the whole system. Right? It's like, I can deal with Darren Wilson being horrible, but you're talking about like ending police? What? That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't compute. What I saw with what happened with Comey is that there was a bifurcation. At least what I saw online, where people were still pissed off at him for putting that letter out against Clinton. So the Clinton support folks are still like, we're not, like, they're not really defending Comey, but they are defending the institution of the FBI, and they want somebody on top that they want to see as a non-political figure, as though anything in this country is non-political. Every friggin' decision that gets made is political, because all politics is about power, to redistribute resources to the people who want to keep it versus the people who need it. That's what politics is. That's why I engage in politics,
What can ordinary people who are living their lives do to contribute to the work that you're doing or the issues that you are hammering on day in, day out in your work?
I say the first thing people can do is find out who their prosecutor is in your local county. Who is the person with the discretion to lock up people? If you don't know that person's name, then it's your civic duty to find out immediately, to find out what they actually have been doing. Go visit them. They're down the street from your house. You have the right to go down there and say to them, so I'm interested in knowing, like, are you tough on crime? Because if you are, you need to go. The next election, I'm going to be there with my friends, my 2-7, my friends from Bridge or whatever from the church, and we are going to vote you out. You have to talk at your local level. Criminal punishment decisions are made at the local level. I mean, at the county level often, right? And your jails are at the county level. So pay attention to that. That's like one thing you can do. It matters who you've elected as your district attorney. Find out who the judges are on the ballots that you get when you go and vote for, like, your senator and your congresspeople, and that's the only thing you check off. That's a dereliction of duty. Find out who the hell the judges are. Bar associations and other people always put out lists. Look and see who is who is being recommended and why, and start voting against those people. As soon as they notice that the public is no longer down for stuff, trust me, they change. They're politicians. They respond to pressure, So I think that would be my second suggestion. And my third suggestion is, listen, it is really, really important not to allow people to demagogue you. Stop assuming that safety, quote unquote, means imprisonment and means more punishment. Start getting the punishment mindset shifted in your mind, so that when you see somebody who is other than you, that your fear factor that is conditioned by all the messages you've gotten your entire life about who to be afraid of, challenge that within yourself for real. And stop being at every point demagogued into locking up people, putting up walls, creating new borders. End that within yourself and try to change people in your circle's ideas about who should. And stop, especially if you're liberal and progressive, stop calling for people to be locked up every day. Oh, so-and-so is a war criminal and they should go to prison. Listen, everybody shouldn't be going to prison. That's the point. Stop playing into those ideas that every time something happens, your first inclination is to think about the prosecution and court system as the way to solve that problem. We all do it instinctively. I don't, because I've literally trained myself out of that over many, many years. But I see it all the time with friends of mine. The first thing that happens, jail the bankers. Really? You think that jailing some Goldman Sachs guys is what is going to end capitalism? No, it's not. And by the way, I don't want Darren Wilson even locked up. That's hard for people to fathom, because this is a killer cop. Of course he should go to jail. No, not even him. So I think we have to reframe our thinking and get out of the criminal, the punishment mindset that we have. It infects everything. It's not just the criminal punishment system. It's the way we treat our children. It's the way we treat our community friends. It's the way we look at young people in the streets and immediately assume that they're doing something negative because they're hanging out on the corner. It infects everything. So I want people to change that, to, change their mindset and think about people as build new relationships with each other in order to be able to keep ourselves safe.
Mariame Kaba, thank you very much for joining us on Intercepted.
Thanks for having me.
Mariame Kaba is the founder of Project NIA and a co-organizer of Survived and Punished. She's on Twitter @PrisonCulture.